Today's daf we're going to learn is Nedarim Daf Kafav. Shavua Tov to everyone. This week's learning is sponsored by Paula and Robert Cohen in loving memory of Paula's mother, Sonia Washik, Sarah Bat Yitzchak, Zichronah Livracha, my grandmother. And this week's learning is sponsored by Jason Friedman and family in honor of Danielle Novetsky Friedman. Happy birthday week to you. Your husband and your kids are very proud of you and your dedication to learning. We love you. Okay, with that, we're going to get started with our very complicated daf, I will warn you. Okay, there's a study guide. It should be helpful. I'm going to also share it on the screen, which will help in keeping organized here. So just to review where we were up to, we started with this idea of nidrei shkagot, then we got into shvuot shkagot, where you accidentally said something you didn't really realize it was a mistake, or later you made a mistake about not fulfilling it, kind of beyond your control. Then we brought this example of a Mishna on Samach Vav in Nedarim. Okay, it's a Mishnah. We're going to read a whole bunch of parts of the Mishnah today. I actually brought the entire Mishnah on the study guide if you want to look at it as a whole. We started with this case of Potchim b'Shabbatot b'Yamim Tovim. Okay, this was relating to the case in the Mishnah. Let's review the case in our Mishnah. I see people eating from my tree, and I say, you're all forbidden. And then I realize that my father and brother were among them. Later, we're only going to talk about the father. It doesn't really make a difference. I realized they were relatives of mine, and I didn't really mean to include them. So in the end, I say, right, Beit Shamai says, well, when I say I didn't realize my father was there, and I didn't really mean to include my father, Beit Shamai says, fine. So you exclude your father. Everybody else is included still. Everyone else is forbidden. Your father's permitted. Beit Hillel says everybody is permitted because Beit Hillel holds, which we're going to see, neder shehutar mikzato hutar kulo. If you undo part of a vow, the entire vow becomes undone. But we're going to have a big machloket. Does Beit Shamai not hold that at all? Do they hold it in some cases? And we're going to have a whole debate between Rabba and Rava about how to understand their machloket. So to get there, first they quote a Mishnah in Daf Samach Vav, as I said, in Nedarim, where we're going to see that Rabbi Akiva holds like Beit Hillel held. And what's clear in that Mishnah, even though it doesn't say it, is that only Rabbi Akiva holds this way, but the rabbis disagree. Okay, that's going to play an important role later. So the case was, I said I won't eat meat, I won't drink wine at all for the year. And then I realized that Shabbos and Yantif, it's really a big problem not to drink wine and eat meat. So I want to get rid of my vow for that. So what do we say? Right, originally by Rishonah, they would say, Otami Yamim Mutarim, Ushar Kol Yamim Musalim. Basically, your neder will stay in place other than Shabbos and Yantif, where you didn't really ever mean to take a neder. It's the same idea. Till Rabbi Akiva came and said, no, neder shutar mitzato utar kula. So comes Rabba, and this is a review of what we did at the end of yesterday's daf, which is Kule Almai. We're now going to have a debate between Rabba and Rava, and I'm going to bring up the sheet right now about which case Rava and Rava each have a different case in which they think the machloket Beit Shamai Beit Hillel is, and in which case they think that they all agree. So if we look here in this chart, there's two cases. One is, we're assuming all the cases start off, even though later we'll see cases that don't start off that way, but where you said everybody's forbidden, and then when you change your words, you say, well, really, had I realized, I would have said everyone's forbidden other than my father. Or case two is, you say, originally you said everyone's forbidden. And then when you realized your father was involved, you said, oh, had I realized my father was there, I would have said it in the following way. I would have said so-and-so and so-and-so is forbidden, and my father is permitted. Okay? So now we're going to talk about both those cases and why there would be a difference between them, according to Rabba. So Rabba says, about 7 lines from the bottom of Kaf Ham, we bet the last word on the line, Amar Rabba. Tikule Alma. Everyone agrees. If I come later and say it, I know my father was there. Everybody agrees in that case. There is no neder shutar mikzato utar kulo. Why? Because it didn't really change what I said originally. I originally said kulchem, everybody. And now I would have said, had I known, what would I have done? I would have said the same thing. You're all forbidden. I just would have excluded my father. So even Beit Hillel or Rabbi Akiva, in that case, in the other Mishnah, Rabbi Akiva, in our case, our Mishnah Beit Hillel, they would all agree that in this case, there's no neder, that part was canceled and the rest, no. All you were doing was explaining yourself, saying, when I said all, I didn't mean all, I meant all, but not my father. Okay? But Lo nechleku ela be'omer ilu hayiti yodea she'aba beinechem hayiti omer ploni u'ploni asurim ve'aba mutar. Now, I didn't explain this in yesterday's class. I'm going to explain it better now, which is, if I change the language, by the way, I'm going to tell you right now, this entire sugya I'm going to explain for simplicity's sake, only according to the Ran. Okay, there's many things that are unclear in this Gemara, which makes it a difficult Gemara. I'm going to go exclusively with the Ran's interpretation to just keep things simple, go with one interpretation, but know that there are other interpretations to things in general. So the Ran says here, particularly as we get later on in the daf, the Ran says here that what's the difference? First of all, what would motivate you to say that had I known, I would have said so-and-so and so-and-so are forbidden and my father's permitted? What's the difference between saying that and I would have said, kulchem asurim, you're all forbidden except for my father? Because when you originally said everyone's forbidden, you included your father in everyone. When you realize later that your father was there, you say, I never would have included my father. Even if I were to say, everyone's forbidden except my father, before I said the word except, I basically included my father with everyone else. And only after did I exclude him. So this guy comes along and says, had I known my father was there, I would have changed my language entirely. I would have specified you, and you, so as to never include my father in the words, everyone's forbidden. Even though a second later you were going to say, except for my father. But by saying everyone, you're including your father in who's forbidden. So basically comes the Ran and he says, and I'm not going to read it inside, but anyone who wants to, if your Hebrew's good, you can read the Ran inside. He explains it very well. But basically the Ran says, the reason here there's a machloket, and all of a sudden Beit Hillel, who didn't think in the first case, it's a neder shu tar miksato tar kulo. In this case, you basically undid your neder in two ways, because you made two mistakes. One is you included your father by accident. Two is you used the wrong language, because had you known your father was there, you never would have said everyone's forbidden except my father. You never would have said the everyone's forbidden that you said in the originally. Again, there's originally you said everyone's forbidden, then you realize your father's there, you say, oh my God, I never would have included my father. I wouldn't have even said everyone's forbidden except my father. I wouldn't have said everyone's forbidden at all, because that would have included my father even for a brief second. So therefore, because you're changing two things here, even though you still agree that everyone else would have been forbidden, but you have two mistakes, he says. Because of that, Beit Hillel says this is a neder shu tar mitzato, and therefore utar kula. Beit Shamai still disagrees, okay? Even though you changed two things, Beit Shammai agrees, sticks with his original. Really, only your father's going to be permitted. Everyone else is forbidden, okay? And only Beit Hillel says your entire neder is invalid, and therefore you don't have a neder at all, and everyone becomes permitted. Okay, so again, just to review before we move on, Rava thinks the machloket is in the case of kulchem. I'm sorry. The machloket is in the case of ploni uploni, where you change entirely. Then we have a machloket. Do we say partial is full or not? And everyone agrees if you stuck with the same language and just really adjusted it minorly and said, well, what I really meant was everyone other than my father, then just your father is excluded. Even Rabbi Akiva, Beit Hillel, none of them would say this is a neder shu tar mitzato tar kula. Now starting on to the top of Kafa. Rava Amar, but Rava with an aleph, that's different Rabba with a hey, we pronounce it as Rabba. Rava with an aleph says, no. De kule alma. Everyone agrees. In the opposite case, he's going to do the flip, but it's going to be the same direction of logic, you'll see in a minute. That once there's two issues, right, it's more likely you're going to say neder shu tar miksato tar kulo, but he's going to go so far as to say that even Beit Shamai agrees in that case. In other words, according to Rava, Beit Shamai doesn't hold neder shu tar mitzato tar kulo. According to Rava, we're going to see, he thinks in the extreme case, even Beit Shamai will agree that if you partially change the neder, the entire thing is off. So let's read that inside. Kulei alma, everyone agrees. Kol hecha da'amar ilu yada hayiti yodea she'aba beinechem hayiti omer ploni uploni asurim v'aba mutar kulam mutarim. If you have those two changes, number one, you changed your father. Number two, you changed the language. You said, I never would have used that language to include my father. Of course, even Beit Shammai agree that it's a neder that partially was, it's even, I would say, more than partially, because you had two things you changed here. and therefore hutar kula. Lo nechleku ela ba'omel, the debate is in the opposite case, okay, and that's what you see in this chart. The debate is in the case number one. The Rava had said there's no debate there. Everyone agrees. You're just explaining yourself. There's not even a change really in your neder. You're not undoing your neder. Comes Rava and says, no, that's where there's a machloket. And let's explain the machloket. Lo nechleku ela ba'omel, ilo hayiti yodea she'aba benechem, hayiti omer kulchem asurim chutz me'ab. Now, what's the machloket? They actually borrow a machloket from a different scenario. Okay, let's explain the different scenario first, and then we'll get to the machloket. The different scenario is like this. If you look at the Rani explained the basic case, it's a case in Tmura, which is all if I substitute a different animal for, if I do a substitution for my animal for a different korban. I'm not going to get into all the details of Tmura, but I say this animal is Tmurat Olah, this animal is Tmurat Shlamim. Now, I said a contradictory statement because I can't say that there's a substitute for a shlamim, for an ola and for a shlamim. It has to be one or the other. Okay, first of all, you're not allowed to tmura at all, but it is effective. I'm not going to get into tmura in the slightest right now. It's not important. We have complicated enough stuff. I'm not going to start with something new. But the point is, if I make a contradictory statement, which has two parts, kind of like a compound word, it's a compound sentence. I say, this is tmura, this is in place of my ola, this is in place of my shlamim. Now, those two things contradict. They're mutually exclusive. So which one did I mean? So do we say that when I say something and then say something else, that I really meant the first thing I said and the second thing was just less important? Or do we say, and there's a debate about how we understand this, that I mean the second part or even the second part? In other words, the second part has significance as well. That's the way most people understand. So if I say, Kulchem asurim chutz me'aba, in other words, again, I started off with everyone's forbidden, and then I changed it to everyone's forbidden except for my father. The question is, where's the emphasis on that sentence? It's not exactly the same, and the Ram points that out. He says, look, it's not a contradictory statement. Everyone's forbidden except my father. One part doesn't contradict the other, but they compare it anyway. And they say, the question is, where's the emphasis on your sentence? If the emphasis is on kulchem asurim, tfos lashon rishon, okay, let's read it inside now. Beit Shamai savre like Rabbi Meir. Okay, remember this is Rabbi Meir. He's going to appear at the end of the sugya. Beit Shamai hold like Rabbi Meir. Da'amal. There's a big machlok at Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yossi about this thing of Tmura. Da'amar tfos lashon rishon. Beit Shamai says the real main thing you wanted to say was everyone's forbidden. You added at the end except for my father, but that's not central. Which means if we look at your neder is really kulchem asurim. So we don't view this as it's batel mikzato, batel kulo, because the chutz me'aba part is very, what's the word? It's not important. Okay. So the key is you said kulchem and you said kulchem. You didn't change, you didn't cancel your neder. So therefore, neder shutar mikzato, utar kulo doesn't kick in here. Now, it's not that he doesn't hold neder shutar mikzato, utar kulo, because a minute ago, Rava said, if there's really two mistakes, he changed about his father and he changed the language he would have used, then already Beit Shammai will agree. It's utar mikzato, utar kulo. You cancel part, the whole thing's canceled. But if you stuck with your original language, then, and in the beginning of what you said, kulchem chutz me'aba, so the kulchem is the continuation of your original neder. There's no cancellation of this neder. You're just excluding your father. That's it. So your father's excluded, everyone else is in. Beit Hillel savri like Rabbi Yossi, he held on the other side of that machloket. Da'amar bigmar dvarav adam nitpas, which again, as I said, most people understand that even the second part is important, and therefore, when you have the second part, my father is not included here. That's significant enough to say that vow is canceled. Okay, and since I canceled part, the whole thing gets canceled. Okay, so that's the way Rava understands the machlok. Okay, so again, but just because it's going to get confusing as we go on, I want to make sure that this part is clearly understood. So again, let's view it according to Rava and then according to Rava. According to Rava, if you said kulchem and you continue to say kulchem, just exclude your father. Nobody has an issue with that. Clearly, you're only excluding your father. You're just explaining your words. That's not considered a neder that's partially canceled. Comes Rava, I'm going to explain this. I'm going to review it differently now by case. Comes Rava and says, what are you talking about? That's exactly where there's a machloket. According to Beit Shamai, we focus on the kulchem asurim, and that continues to be the same, and therefore we just exclude the father. According to Beit Hillel, we go by the end. That was a shift. That was a change. It goes into the category of utar mitzato, utar kulo. We cancel part, we cancel the whole thing. Everyone's permitted to eat whatever you forbade them. If you switched entirely and shifted into ploni asurim va'abam mutar and said, I would have changed the language because I would never have wanted to include my father in the beginning of say, everyone's forbidden. I would never have used that wording had I known my father was there. I would have pointed to each person. Then, according to Raba, that's when there's a machloket. Since we changed everything, that's a neder shu tar mitzato tar kulo, right? Again, we didn't change everything entirely, but we changed the language about everyone else, even though they're still in the same status, but we would have changed the language and we would have taken out my father. Already two things. Beit Hillel says that's a neder shu tar mitzato tar kulo. Beit Shamai just don't hold this concept at all of neder shu tar mitzato tar kulo, according to Raba. According to Rava, they do, but according to Rava, they don't. And this we're going to see in Rava. Rava says, no. In this case, they all agree that even Beit Shamai holds, when there's already two changes, of course, we're going to say the whole neder is nullified, okay, canceled and not existent. That's the debate between Rava and Rava. Now comes the more complicated part. That wasn't complicated enough. Rav Papa Rav. Okay, now I say it's complicated because you're going to see there's a lot missing from the words in the Gemara. So we're going to have to use the Ran to fill in all the missing details. So now, Rabbi Akiva, Neder Shutar Miksato Tarkulo. We're going to this Mishna, which I brought in its entirety at the top of the page. Okay, so if you want to read the whole Mishna, you can read the whole Mishna. You can see that there's a number of different cases here. Okay, we're going to deal with the first three. Basically, the Gemara wants to know, what is a neder when they said, Rabbi Akiva came and taught that a vow that's partially canceled is entirely canceled, to which the Mishnah says, Ketzad, what is a case of that? Show me a case. So they bring three cases, which theoretically could be viewed as three separate cases, as you see. Okay, if you look at the chart, there's the first column, which says either Konam she'eni na'aneh lekulchem, and then she'eni na'aneh le'lezeh v'lezeh. There are two cases. The second case splits into two. But first, the Gemara is going to view it as three separate cases. Okay, there's a debate about how to look at this exactly. So I even debated when I did the bullets in the beginning to bullet them as three separate, which I decided to do. But theoretically, it's really, in the end, the conclusion is going to be that it's really two cases with two bullets in the second case. But right now, the Gemara is going to view it as three cases. Okay, one confusing part about the Gemara is that they're going to call Reisha and Seifa, first part and second part, even though there's three parts. And when they read this sugya, what they're going to basically do is read this Mishnah Rabba's way, read it Rava's way, say Rava's way makes no sense. You can't read this Mishnah, okay? And then each time they're going to talk about the Reisha and the Seifa, okay? I'm just telling you what's one of the confusing parts so that you know in advance. According to Rava, the Reisha is going to be case 1 and case 2, and the Seifa is going to be case 3. And according to Rava, the Reisha is going to be case 1 only, and the Seifa is going to be case 2. Okay, so it's confusing because when they refer to Seifa, they refer to different cases. Again, I'm doing this all according to the Ran's commentary. So there might be other commentaries, but I'm going just exclusively with the Ran. So let's read the case and then we'll try to explain. Ketzad amar Rabbi Akiva neder shutar mitzato tar kulo. So what is the case? Konam she'eni neheneh lekulchem. If you say, right, this sounds like the first statement you said, which is, if you forbid anyone, right, from benefiting from that, I won't benefit from anyone, right, from all of you, not neheneh, to all of you. And then it turns out your father was among them, let's say. Hutar echad mehem, hutru kulam. If one was permitted, they're all permitted. Okay, first we're just learning the cases, then we'll see what they do with them. She'eni neheneh lo lezeh v'lo lezeh. If you use the language, I'm not going to benefit, not from you, and not from you, and not from you, and you did each person individually, hutar harishon hutru kulam. If the first one is the one that you undid the neder of, then all of them are permitted. Hutar ha'acharon, if you did the last one, ha'acharon mutar b'kulam asurim. The last one is permitted. If you undid the last one, let's say your father was last, so your father would be permitted and all the others would be forbidden. If your father was first, then it sounds like everyone would be permitted if you undid your father. So we don't really understand yet what that means. And you're going to see they do a strange commentary of it in the beginning, according to Rav Papa's question on Rava, but hold off on it. So Bishlama, now here we're going to have one simple line to explain what's clear, and you're going to have a super, super, super long commentary of the Ran. That's why this talk is so short, because the Ran has a long explanation of all the things that are missing here that the Gemara didn't tell you that they mean, okay? We're going to have to fill in a lot of details, and that's why, again, this is open to commentary. But we're going to go with the Ran, as I said. So Bishlama l'Raba. Now, the first thing you have to realize is the Mishna says this is where Rabbi Akiva holds, and Neder that's partially canceled is entirely canceled, which means it's code word for saying, and the rabbis disagree with him. That's important to understand, just like Beit Shamai, Beit Hillel disagree. So now we're going to have to go back to our chart of Rava and Raba. If we're giving examples of where Rabbi Akiva disagrees with the rabbis, it's going to have to be either, right, Ploni uploni, where there's a machloket according to Raba, or it's going to have to be kulchem, which is the case of a machloket according to Rava. You follow? So we're going to have to plug in, right? We're going to start with what we know about Rava and Raba and what they each hold about where there's a machloket and plug it into here. So right now we're focusing only on Rava. So as not to confuse you, let's just review Rava. Rava says, when is there a machloket? When we switch everything. We switch the language, and we switch the father, right? We take the father out of the picture and we say, oh, had I known the father was there, I never would have used that language. So now, if you look very simply, again, if you look at the three cases, because again, right now they're going to view it as three separate cases. Case number one, if you get rid of one, they're all permitted, right? That means there's a machloket about hutar mitzato, hutar kula. Second case, same thing. Hutar rishon, forget rishon and acharon right now. One is permitted. Hutru kulam, all are permitted. That's what Rabbi Akiva says, hutar mitzato, hutar kulo, and the rabbis disagree. So we're going to have in both these cases explain that these are both two different cases of a machloket between them. Now remember, according to Rabbi, there's only one case where there's a machloket, but we'll get back to that. Then there's one case where we basically say, only one is permitted, they're all else stays forbidden, okay? So now we're going to basically, okay, in simple terms, you can see the bolded. Rabba is going to say case number one is where he switched the language. Because again, when you switch the language, according to Rabba, that's when there's a machloket. In case number two, you switch the language. Case number three is you have the same language. Now, even though that's not what appears in the text of the Mishnah, but a lot is missing from the Mishnah. The Mishnah only told us what he said originally. The Mishnah didn't tell us when he changed his mind, what language did he use. So basically, what they're going to come and say is, when it says konam she'eni neheneh kulchem, the first case, it must be that you originally said kulchem, and then you changed it to lizeh, which is basically like ploni or ploni. So you started off with kulchem, and then you started saying, oh, had I known, I wouldn't have forbidden it to, I would have forbidden it to so-and-so, 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 and not to my father, let's say. And that's where hutaracham and hutar kulam, that's exactly where Rabba says there's the machloket. And I added the words here according to the Ran. You changed it from a klal to a prat. You changed it from everyone to being more specific about each individual. Okay? Again, what was the logic there? That why is that considered a change? We have to explain why that's a significant enough change to basically say that's what prompts Rabbi Akiva to say, when there's a significant enough change, you've changed two elements. We already don't look at it as, oh, you're just translating what you meant. You're, reshuffling a little bit, but you're actually undoing your vow because you've shifted. You said, oh, I never would have said kulchem, included my father. I would have been more specific, you and you and you, so as not to include my father in the beginning. That's exactly, and that's what we're doing is we're reading Rabba into this Mishnah. Case number two, she'eni neheneh lo lezeh v'lo lezeh. According to the Ran, originally you said lo lezeh v'lo lezeh. This is a case we haven't discussed yet. And at the end you said, oh, had I known, I would have said all of you are forbidden except for my father. So it's the exact same thing where you've switched the language. It's just the opposite case. So this, the Ran says, what's new about this? Well, this you're switching from individual to general, as opposed to general to individual, kulchem to lezeh. You're switching from individual. You originally said, you basically see this group of people and you say, you, not realizing your father's among them. And then you say, oh my God, did I realize my father was there? I never would have said you, but not my father. Why is that? Because out of respect for my father, I would want to take him out immediately. I want to say this is the opposite logic, okay? And the Ram basically says some people would prefer to do this and some people would prefer to do that. And therefore, This is a change. Instead of saying in the first reading, we said, oh, of course, you'd rather say, instead of kulchem, you don't want to include your father in the forbidden category. So you would have started with every individual and never included your father in the forbidden category. This logic is someone else who says, no. I'd rather, as soon as possible, exclude my father from the group. So instead of starting to say you are forbidden, which my father's waiting a long time till he hears, oh, I'm permitted, or people watching are thinking, oh, maybe you're going to put your father in the forbidden category. Out of respect for my father, I'm going to want to get to the exception as quickly as possible. So I would have said, and I know my father was there, I would have said, instead of you, I would have said, everyone except my father, so I can quickly get to the words except my father. Okay, so we're basically playing with logic one way or the other. The main point is, since there's a significance to the change in language, and you're not including your father anymore, that's two changes. If that's the case where Rava thinks there's a machloket between Beit Hillel and Beit Shamai, in which case also Rabbi Akiva and the rabbis. So that would be case number 1 and 2 of the Mishnah. That all is called the Resha. So let's just read this in the words again, because again, the words are don't tell you everything. Bishlam ala Raba, mokim la Resha damar lizeu lizeh. You know, that's very short words for saying, again, this is why the Ran's adding a lot of words. When you said kulchem in the beginning, you said lizeu lizeh at the end. And then when you said lizeu lizeh, you said kulchem at the end. Okay, even though that's not the words here in the Gemara, that's what you'd have to say. Seifa, now what's all of a sudden this case where everyone agrees that only one is permitted and all the rest are forbidden? Now let's just go back before we even read this inside. Let's go back to Rabba's approach. Rabba said that if you said kulchem in the beginning, and then you continued and said kulchem asurim chutz me'aba, everyone agrees that everyone's forbidden and the father's permitted, because you're really only just explaining your words. So, very simple. Seifa damar likulchem. Okay, now, it's a little tricky because the Seifa was she'eni neheneh lo lezeh v'lezeh, which split into two, hutar rishon to true kulam, hutar acharon mutar. To which the Ran explains what he really means to say here is, you started with kulchem and you ended with kulchem, or you started with lezeh lezeh and you ended with lezeh lezeh. In other words, you kept your language the same. And if you keep your language the same, that's exactly the case where Rabba says everyone agrees that only the father's permitted, everyone else is forbidden. So you basically have to say that the last case is whatever he started with is what he was consistent with. Again, this is very hard to read into the simple reading of this Mishnah and the way they split it up. And even the Gemara is going to ask that very short. Okay? Because what it really doesn't relate to very well is what's this Rishon and Acharon? Rishon and Acharon sounds like the first in the group and the last in the group. When you did lizeh, it doesn't really make sense. The Ran gives some sort of interpretation. He says in the third to last line from the bottom, hutar acharon klamar echad mehen. If it's one of them, acharon hutar kulam asurim, it doesn't really fit, and that's later what the Gemara is going to ask. Okay, but the basic thing is we can, since there's cases where they all agree that one is forbidden and all, right, and everyone else becomes asur, which is in a case where the consistent language, according to Rabba, and they argue in a case where the language switches, we can find a case that these Mishnayot fit into, according to Rabba. What's the problem? Ela ledidach, but according to you, Rabba, this is again Rav Papa's question on Rabba. Bishlama Reisha. Now, again, we have to find a case in the first case. What are we looking for? Where there's a machloket. So Bishlama Reisha Mokima da Amar Lekuchen. Remember what Rava said. Rava said, when's there a machloket? The machloket is about tfos lashon rishon or go by the lashon acharon. That would be in a case where I started with kulchem and I continued with kulchem, but I just said kulchem except for my father. And then the question is, do we focus on the kulchem? And that stayed the same. And there, that's Beit Shamai, who says we don't think this neder is canceled. Or do we go by the second part, which undid your neder, basically? And then you'd say, hutar mitzeta hutar kula. That's the machloket. So the first case we can easily explain in that way. You started with kulchem, konam she'eni neneh lekulchem, which is the case of the Mishnah in Samach Vav. So, and then, even though it doesn't tell you what you ended with, right? According to Rava, we read it as you ended with, you switch the language. According to Rava, we want a case where they argue, so we're going to say you kept the same language, and the Mishnah is talking about Rabbi Akiva's approach, which is we go by Gemar Dvarav Adam Nitpas. We go by the end, you switch. That's a neder. Shutar Mitzato Char Kulo, and the rabbis disagree. But unlike the previous case, where we were able to make a distinction between whether you use the word kulchem or whether you use lezeh or lezeh, and you switched your language and it had significance, in this case, if I started with ploni or ploni and I ended with ploni or ploni, if we try to say that's the next case, the way we did with Rabba, and we said, well, that's just a continuation. It's the same kind of case, just with a different language. There's nothing new about that. If I said not lezeh or lezeh, and then I come back and I say, well, not lezeh or lezeh or lezeh, but yes to my father, and I didn't mean to include my father, that would be the exact same machloket, and there would be nothing new and no reason for the Mishnah to give that case. So therefore, they say, according to you, though, ela seifa da'amar lezeh or lezeh, the assumption here is that lezeh or lezeh is when you changed your language. Now, again, what happens if you change your language? Let's go back to Rava, to our chart. In the case where you said ploni or ploni, and when you originally said kulchem, that was our original case, and then you switched and said ploni or ploni, what did we say here? Everyone agrees that it's a neder shutar mitzato tar kulo, according to Rava. And what does this Mishnah say? If you're going to change the language to lezeh or lezeh, right? She'eni nene lo lezeh v'lezeh, and they, again, another confusing thing. I don't want to cause you to get too confused. But in the case when we read it according to Rava, we assumed you started with lezeh or lezeh. According to this, we're assuming you changed to lezeh or lezeh. At the end, you said lezeh or lezeh. First, you said kulchem, then you said lezeh or lezeh. Everyone agrees that it's permitted. The point here is that if the first one is same language with a minor change, this must be different language, because otherwise, why is there a second case? And if it's different language, well, according to Rava, everyone agrees. And according to the Mishnah, it's listed as this is Rabbi Akiva's opinion, and the rabbis disagree with him. So that's what the Gemara says, Rabbi Akiva, how could you possibly say it's Rabbi Akiva? Am I pliga Rabbanan? The rabbis don't disagree. Ha'amarta, divrei hakol mutal. Didn't you say, Rava, that everyone would agree if you change the language? Everyone agrees that it's permitted to everybody. But even those who disagree with Rabbi Akiva would say, this is a neder, right? Even Beit Shamai say it's a neder shutar mitzato tar kula. So Rava, how do we read the Mishnah? To which Rava answers with a counter question. He basically says the whole way you understood it according to Rava makes no sense. And this goes back to what I told you before, that it didn't relate at all to the Rishon and Acharon and what they're talking about. And therefore, Rava is going to have a whole different meaning of case number 2 and 3 in the Mishnah, which has nothing to do with anything, which doesn't raise any question on him at all. Amar le Rava, ule Rabba, Rabbi Akiva minicha. He says, wait, you're trying to say everything fit perfectly according to Rava. But Rabbi Akiva makes no sense here. Why? Seifa b'mai mokima. The Seifa, what? That's how the Seifa doesn't work at all. Okay? You can read it as minicha Seifa. Does the Seifa make any sense at all? Because b'mai mokima, what did you say the Seifa was? Damar kulchem, right? We said that the last case was you started with the language and you continue with the same language, whether it was kulchem or whether it was lezeh or lezeh, you had the same language. If so, heidin hu rishon, veheidin hu acharon. What does it mean? Right? Remember, we have this distinction, and this is why I said originally Rav Papa looks at this as if this is 3 totally separate cases, but not really. It's really a case that says if you use that language, which again it's not clear in the beginning or at the end, but then if you permit the first one, they're all permitted. If you permit the last one, only the last one is permitted. All the rest are forbidden. So according to you, who's the Rishon and who's the Acharon? In other words, your commentary had absolutely nothing. The way you read the Mishnah, he's talking to Rav Papa. According to Rabba, it makes no sense the end, because what's the difference? The first one or the last one? It makes no sense. So therefore, he says, you misunderstood this entirely. Ela Reisha, the only thing you understood was the Reisha. The Reisha I'll give you. I'm going to explain it according to me. Rava says, Reisha da'amar lekulchem. Okay, that makes sense. Remember, he starts with kulchem, he ends with kulchem, and that's exactly according to Rava when there's a debate. Do we go by the beginning? He said kulchem, and before that he had said kulchem also, so that works. And he's just modifying a little bit. That's Beit Shamai. Or Rabbi Akiva and Beit Hillel will disagree and say, no. Big Gemara dvarav adam needs pass. It's the end. It's the except for my father. That's a big change. That's canceling the vow. So that makes sense that Rabbi Akiva holds this, but not the rabbis. Seifa is a totally different case. The case number 2 and 3 is really just one case that splits into 2, and it's a totally different situation. What is it? Kigon, and now we'll finally understand the Rishon and Acharon. Kigon shetzala'an zebazeh va'amar Ploni kiploni uploni kiploni. You actually made a whole bunch of different vows. It's not one vow that partially is canceled and then they're all canceled. It's another case where you could have vows that part of it is canceled and everything else is canceled, but it depends on the scenario. So let's say I see all these people by my tree and I say, I'm vowing, I'm forbidding you from eating on my tree. And then I say, and I'm forbidding you like him. And then I say, and I'm forbidding you like him, and I'm forbidding you like him, and I'm forbidding you like him. And you point to all these people, and among them is your father, or among them is someone you didn't want to include. So now, if that's the case, the Mishna doesn't tell you the rest, the Gemara, but it's obvious what happens here. Okay, this is, I'll give you a good example. If you use Excel, right, and you put in a formula, or you put in a, right, you put in a number, and then your next, what do you call it? Your next box, or I can't think of the word, but your next, thing is you say equals that, and then your next one equals that, and your next one equals, right? Each one equals the one before it, okay? If you get rid of the first one, what will happen? Everything disappears because everything's based on the first one, right? It could be a formula, it could be whatever it is, right? But if it's all based on the first one, you get rid of the first one, it's gone. If you get rid of the last one, it doesn't affect anything. So that's what we're saying here. Since each neder, I said, you are like you, and you are like you, and you are like you, if I got rid of the first one, which everyone's based on, then everyone's permitted. Because once I hutar that one, everyone else is permitted. Hutar acharon, but if I got rid of the last one, like let's say I delete that last formula, all the other formulas stay in place because I didn't change anything. They had nothing to do with it, right? It was just the last one was like the previous one. Okay, the previous one stays. And so is the previous and the previous. So that's what it means, hutar acharon, acharon, mutar, v'kulam asurim. In which case, this is absolutely nothing to do with our topic, okay? Because it's a different case. It's not one neder that was partially canceled. It's several nedarim that are all based on each other. And he's going to further prove that that's the case. Taikanami, Ditanya, there's a braita on this Mishnah. By the way, these words, when you look at the Mishnah on Samach Vav, appear in the Mishnah in parentheses. Clearly, there was there's a lack of clarity about this is a braita on the Mishnah. Maybe somebody added it and then it got incorporated into the text by accident. From our Gemara, it's clear it's a braita, because there's a braita on our Mishnah that says, hutar ha'emtsa'i. Okay, let's go back to that Excel example. If you get rid of a middle one, what's going to happen? All the formulas before that are still in place, and all the ones after it are deleted. So, heimenu ulamata mutarim, from there down, anyone after that middle person is gone. Ulamala asurim, anyone above that person is asurim. That makes it very clear that our interpretation is the right one. And therefore, Rava says, there's no question against me from that Mishnah, because that Mishnah was talking about something else. You misunderstood the Mishnah. Okay, that's what he says to Rav Papa. That was our really complicated part of today's daf. The rest should be a little simpler if you got part one, which is we're now going to, or the two parts, right? The first part was establishing the machloka between Rava and Raba about when they argue, right? Does Beit Shamai or the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Akiva have neder shutar miksato tar kulo in certain situations when there's really a big change or not, right? And is there machloket about neder shutar miksato tar kulo in general, or is it about tfos lashon rishon or tfos lashon achron? Then we tried to bring this Mishnah as the later part of the Mishnah that we already discussed as a contradiction to Rava, but Rava can explain it according to his interpretation, and his pshat actually makes a lot more sense as opposed to the complicated, convoluted way we had that Rav Papa was trying to explain it according to Rava, and then stuck with no way to explain according to Rava. In the end, we have a much better explanation. It was much simpler. Now, it's a little simpler. We're now going to quote another line in that Mishnah of another case where Rabbi Akiva is going to say, this is a case of hutar mitzato hutar kulo. And what's the case? Konam batzal sha'ani toem, shabatzal ra lalev. I'm forbidding all onions. I'm not going to eat onions because onions are bad for the heart. Amrulo, they said to him, Valoha kufli yafel alev. But wait, there's a type of onion called kufli, which is good for the heart. Hutar bekufli, velo bekufri bilvad hutar ela b'chol ha'psalim. So not only is kufri permitted to him, but he's permitted to all of them again. Why? Neder shutar mitzato tar kulo. Maseh haya, there was a case. V'itiru Rabbi Meir b'chol ha'psalim. There was a case, and even Rabbi Meir permitted him to eat all onions. Now, what's the problem with this? By the way, Rava and Raba questions Rava on this. It's actually a question on Rava as well, but we're going to focus on Rava right now for today. My lab. Now, it didn't say here what the person said when they found out that these kind of onions are good for you. What was their reaction, right? It all depends. Did they say, oh, well, kulchem asurim, except for kufri? And then, right, what do we see here? Or did they say, if I had known, I would have said this and this and this and this, right? And then obviously it's going to depend on how you read it. So let's read. My lavd amar. So right now they're assuming, to make this assumption, that he must have said, now, again, what would have happened? He said, we're assuming, this is an assumption that we're going to reject in a minute, but right now the assumption is he must have said the kulchem, right? This kulchem version, which is he started with all onions. Then he said, oh, all except for this. And what did Rava say? It's a machloket, tvos l'shon rishon, o b'gmar dvarav adam nitpas. Now remember, Beit Shamai holds b'gmar dvarav adam nitpas based on Rabbi Meir. Now, if you hold b'gmar dvarav, what do you say? Everyone's asur except for that onion, right? He only permitted that type of onion. And what does it say here? That Rabbi Meir even permitted all onions, and that doesn't follow Rava's explanation, b'gmar dvarav adam nitpas. So, to which the Gemara says, lo, that's not, why did you assume that the language was kulchem? It was be'omer, mutar, in which case you changed both ploni, right? You changed the language and you changed that type of onion. And that, according to Rava, what do we say? Everyone agrees that kula mutarim, because kulo, which would explain Rabbi Meir said all onions are mutar. In which case, Rabbi Meir, aliba de Rabbi Akiva, aliba de Rabbanan, right? In this case, both Rabbi Akiva and the rabbis who disagree with him, again, reading it in Rava's way, would say, as long as you change the language and excluded that onion, you would have an agreement upon everybody. So then you basically say, Rabbi Meir holds by everybody here, and everyone would say the same thing. In this case, again, it all depends on the Mishna was specifically didn't mention the most important part, according to Rava and Raba. In other words, that it's all the language that you use, and that makes all the difference. The Mishna didn't mention that, right? There's a good case where you see that Amoraim kind of understood things a little differently, because if it was so important, the Mishna would have mentioned it. But through the Amoraim's eyes, it's missing the basics. They suggest maybe it's those basics. No, it must be the other. In other words, what language should you use? Well, we can make it fit to Rava's interpretation that there was a total switch in language. And even in that case, the rabbis would agree that the whole thing is dissolved. And therefore, Rabbi Meir can explain himself, both according to Rabbi Akiva and according to the rabbis, through Rava's eyes, basically, through Rava's interpretation. So we're going to continue more with questions, one more question tomorrow, and then I'm going to finish one last point before we get to the next Mishna. Okay, like I said, this was a very complicated daf. Hopefully the chart, I added a whole bunch of things in the chart that kind of clarify what exactly is happening at each stage, right? What made it complicated was, number one, the Reisha and Seifa mean different things. The interpretation Rav Papa brings for the Mishnah doesn't really fit in with the simple reading of wording of the Mishnah, which is, again, in the end, what they reject Rav Papa's question with because of that. And a lot of words are missing from the text of the Gemara that the Ran needed to fill in. Like I said, because a lot of it was unclear, there are other interpretations and other ways of reading this sugya entirely differently. But I felt like this was going one way was a better way to read this sugya, as opposed to, it was complicated enough as it is according to one interpretation, not to complicate it by reading others. But just I like to let you know that there are different ways to read this sugya. With that, wishing everyone a Shavua Tov.